Okay, so let's get started. We are on part 24 of our series on the devil's chessboard, and we are in chapter kind of in the middle of the current chapter, which is the fingerprints of intelligence. Or,
Please add SR71 as co-host too.
Sure.
Just to be, extra careful. Thank you.
Sure. This is chapter 19, or to use Brennan's words, the hallmarks of intelligence. All right. So we had finished talking about George de Morgenshield's role leading up to the assassination of JFK and his testimony during the Warren Commission. So we're going to move on to the next person that John or David Talbot wants to highlight in his book. If a legend was being woven around Lee Harvey Oswald, there was nobody who did more to move Oswald's story along during his days in Dallas, besides George de Morgenshield, than a young housewife named Ruth Paine. It was Ruth Paine who took Marina and her young child as the Oswalds' marriage started coming apart. It was she who most closely observed the intimate details of Lee's life. Oswald would plant clues for Ruth, like the draft of a puzzling letter to the Soviet embassy in Washington that he left on her typing desk. That made her suspect he was a spy. Did he do this sort of thing on purpose? She wondered later. Was it part of a profile that he was supposed to be leaving behind? She was a curious type. Some people would use the word busybody. The sort of woman who felt like she could set the world straight, and it was her obligation to do so. We've all had neighbors like that. After her husband, Michael, took an engineering job at Bell Helicopter in Fort Worth, which is a whole nother story, Ruth found herself marooned in Texas. She was a liberal arts educated Quaker from up north who was stuck in what she referred to as cowboy culture. Her isolation only grew when she and Michael began drifting apart and he moved out of the family's home to his own apartment in September of 1962. So when a friend invited her to a party at his house the following February, she went. Among the other guests that were there was the Oswalds. Ruth had taken up Russian several years before. How convenient. And here was an opportunity to speak with someone else. It was the de Morgenshields who brought the Oswalds to the party and introduced them. Later, JFK conspiracy researchers made much of this, suggesting that it was not an introduction, but a handoff, as the de Morgenshields prepared to go to Haiti. But if Ruth Paine was assuming de Morgenshield's role as Oswald's monitor, she was doing it, the author says, not as a witting agent. Paine would later tell the Warren Commission that she had never met Baron de Morgenshield before and had not seen him since that fateful evening. While she found Lee somewhat tedious and full of himself, she was immediately taken to Marina. In spite of my faulty Russian, I found her easy to talk to. Ruth got Marina's address and wrote to her soon after, asking if she would like to come visit her sometime. A friendship started. Paine collaborated with author Thomas Mullen on a best-selling book intended to prove that there was nothing conspiratorial about the events in Dallas, only serendipity. A generous young mother takes in family of the future assassinated President the future assassin of President Kennedy, and her life is never the same. End of story, according to her. Payne is a woman of stubborn conviction. Even in quiet retirement in Northern California, she continues to dismiss all conspiracies in Dallas. During a recent visit to her home some 50 years after the assassination, there was only a fleeting moment when Ruth acknowledged that Oswald might have been a pawn in a historical drama much larger than himself. When her visitor suggested that Oswald could have been prey for those of cynical intentions, she quickly nodded. My parents had a name for that: shut-eye liberals. It's a term that applies equally to Ruth Payne. In April of 63, she was 30 years old and, like Marina, had two small children and estranged from her husband. When she invited the Russian woman and her little girls to move into her two-bedroom house outside of Dallas, she would grow to love Marina as a sister. But despite Ruth's best intention, she helped lay waste to the Oswald's life. And in the end, Marina wished she had never met her. Ruth Payne has always scoffed at the idea that she played an intelligence role in Oswald's story. Well, she couldn't say she did, or she wouldn't be alive. But they were the sort of people who could come to the attention of security agents, meaning Ruth and her husband, Michael. In fact, Alan Dulles himself knew all about the unusual family background of the Paynes. It's a very interesting story. Ruth Payne's parents, Carol and William Hyde, met at Stanford University in the 1920s. They were dedicated foot soldiers for the Norman Thomas Socialist Party crusade. Ruth remembers passing out Norman Thomas presidential campaign buttons in 1940 when she was 8 years old with her parents. Her parents were active members of a cooperative movement, and William went to work as an executive at Nationwide Insurance Company. Hyde's involvement in the Socialist Party and co-op movement brought them into bare-knuckle conflicts with the Communist Party, which was in the habit of trying to muscle in on the left-wing area. The CIA, which took a strong interest in anti-communist left, eventually took an interest in Ruth's father. According to a CIA document, Hyde was considered for covert use in Vietnam in 1957, but for unexplained reasons, they decided not to use him. That's not necessarily true, by the way. A lot of times they will document that they didn't use someone and then have them hired by one of their front companies. So just take that with a grain of salt. Hyde did work for a year in Peru, setting up a co-op credit union for USAID. It was AID at the time, doing the same exact thing that they did once they were reorganized as USAID. So we know all about USAID and it being a front for the CIA. Government documents suggest that Ruth's sister, Sylvia, also worked for the CIA. Sylvia's husband, John Hoke, worked for AID as well. You can't make this up. In short, the young Dallas housewife who took the Oswald family into her care was not simply a Quaker do-gooder, but a woman with a politically complex family history. She grew up in a strongly anti-communist wing of America that overlapped with the espionage world. Ruth Payne was not an operative herself, maybe, but there was a constellation of operatives all around her. But it was the family background of Ruth's husband, Michael, that was the most directly overlapping with Alan Dulles. Mary Bancroft, Dulles's mistress, was one of the oldest friends of Michael Payne's mother. Really? Her name was also Ruth. Michael's parents, George Lyman Payne Jr. Where's that Lyman word keep coming up? That's a weird name. And there's so many people in this story, not the JFK story, but the Gladio story, that has that name. And Michael's mother's real name, full name, is Ruth Forbes. Yes, that Forbes Payne. An offspring of a prominent New England heritage with minds as restless as hers. Lyman was an architect and a gentleman Trotskyite whose political activities earned him a place in the FBI watch list. Ruth Forbes Payne hailed from the Boston blue blood family that had made its fortune on Chinese tea and Chinese opium. She would give herself over to the pursuit of world peace and exploration of human consciousness. Sure. And in the 20s, Mary was a regular at salons presided over by Lyman and Ruth in their spacious studio apartment on the Upper East Side of New York City. The gatherings included artists, trust fund revolutionaries, truth seekers, and devotees of the esoteric. Ruth Forbes Payne came from such established Yankee wealth that her family owned its own island, Noshin Island off of Cape Cod. After she and Lyman divorced, Ruth would take her sons, Michael and Cameron, to summer on the island. The Forbes family often extended invitations to their circle of friends to join them at their cottages. Among those invited by Ruth Forbes Payne was Allen Dulles and Mary Bancroft. As the Warren Commission went about its business, Mary wrote Dulles chatty letters about the Forbes and the Paynes and their horrified reaction to the events in Dallas, as if she were back in her wartime role writing him spy notes. For those of you who weren't here at the beginning, Mary Bancroft actually worked, not only was she his girlfriend, she was a friend of his wife's and wrote him intelligence notes back and forth. Bancroft reminded Dulles that she had known Mike Payne's mother extremely well over 40 years and had spent the summers on their island. She also said that there were lovable oddities and their sense of grand entitlement. I was always fascinated by those proper Boston homes, she said, and by the Forbes family at Noshin, where I spent a lot of time, she wrote in a letter in 1964 to Dulles. In those homes, anyone could say absolutely anything. Everything was accepted and examined. One met labor leaders, pacifists, Negroes, everything but Catholics. They didn't like Catholics. Catholics liked JFK. Lyman Payne, Ruth's first husband, and Michael Payne's father came from a similar background. Boston blue bloods. Mary summed up the privileged and political eccentric world of the Paynes by making a devastating comparison, one that had certainly already occurred to Dulles. I would only like to point out that this is the same kind of background that one runs into with in the Noel Field and Alger Hiss, this Quaker early American family thing. Dulles knew the type well. He had a history of putting such people like that to good use. They were blissfully do-gooders that he used. It was another striking coincidence in the endlessly fascinating Oswald story. The housewife who took the Oswalds under her wing had married into a family that was well known to not only Dulles, but his mistress as well. Ruth Payne was aware of her mother-in-law's connections to Bancroft and Dulles. Her mother-in-law, in fact, told her that she invited the couple to enjoy a getaway on the family island. Dulles himself acknowledged the flat out weirdness of such curious facts in his own characteristic fashion by laughing it off. The conspiracy minded would have a field day, he chuckled, if they knew that he had visited Dallas 3 weeks before the assassination and that he had a personal connection to the woman whom he identified as Marina Oswald's landlady. But Ruth Paine was more than that. She was also the woman who, the month before JFK's arrival in Dallas, informed Lee about the job at the book depository, the warehouse building that was in the final stretch of JFK's motorcade. Ruth had been told about the job by a neighbor. The building was owned by yet another intriguing character in the Oswald drama, Texas millionaire David Howard Byrd. D.H. Byrd recents scant attention after the Kennedy assassination, despite him owning the building. The Warren Commission never questioned him, not one time, and reporters did not profile him, even after the millionaire took the odd step of removing the window from which Oswald allegedly fired the shots at the Kennedy limousine and hung it in his house. Byrd said he feared the souvenir hunters might steal it, so he took it home as a trophy and hung it on the wall. Byrd's name was woven through the turbulent politics of the Kennedy era. He was a crony of LBJ and a cousin of Senator Harry Byrd of Virginia, a white supremacist and leader of the rising conservative movement. He also belonged to Suite 8F group. For those of you who's been with us for a long time, what was Suite 8F? Bridget, SR, either one of you remember? No? Suite 8F is the group in Houston that was featured throughout the book, The Mafia, the CIA, and George Bush. That Suite 8F, where all of the people in the savings and loan, CIA, money laundering, drug trafficking met a lot. And he's a member of that group too. Isn't that amazing? The group included George Brown, Herman Brown of Brown and Root. You know, that defense contractor that wasn't going to get any business if peace broke out? Yeah, Brown and Root. The owner of the book depository was closely associated with a number of passionate Kennedy adversaries, including General Curtis LeMay, who relentlessly advocated for nuclear showdown with the Soviet Union. So much so that JFK said he was crazy, like insane crazy. LeMay bestowed a glowing Air Force commendation on Byrd in May of 1963 for his role in founding the Civil Air Patrol. The Civil Air Patrol, where David Ferrari was, where supposedly that's where he met Lee Harvey Oswald. Yeah, that's Civil Air Patrol. Did Byrd and his associates in the national security field use Ruth Paine to maneuver Oswald into the Texas book depository by passing word of the job opening? Always looking for ways to help, Ruth quickly tipped off Lee about the job. The earnest Quaker might have played a pivotal role, even if it was unknowingly. But one way or the other, Oswald seemed doomed to end up in the building and to meet his date with infamy. By October 1963, when he went to work in the building, there were too many unforeseen forces at work all around him. In the months leading up to the Kennedy assassination, Oswald was moved here and there with calculating master chess player moves. In April, he returned to his hometown, New Orleans, with Marina and the girls, where he called attention to himself by jumping into the Cuban politics. He reached out to Fair Play for Cuba Committee, the leading pro Castro group in the US, which was the target of both FBI and CIA. At the same time, he was dallying with Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Oswald also made contact with the DRE, a young militant anti Castro Cuban exile group overseen by CIA David Phillips. So he's supposedly on both sides of that issue, so they can use him either way. Oswald began passing out fair play leaflets in the streets while working in the same building as Guy Bannister, the former FBI agent who was also involved in anti-communist operations that put him in very close orbit with the CIA. Oswald's double dealing was bound to lead to a blowup, and in August it did when he was angrily confronted by DRE activists while passing out pro-Castro flyers. The New Orleans police lieutenant, who later investigated the tussle, reported that Oswald seemed to have staged the whole thing to create an incident. But when the incident occurred, he remained absolutely peaceful and gentle. The New Orleans dust-up recalled Oswald's theatrics in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. In early September, Oswald popped up again in Dallas, where he and his family had moved back. This Oswald sighting was extremely suggestive, since he was spotted in the company of David Atlee Phillips, one of the more glaring indications that the ex-Marine was involved in an intelligence operation. Oswald and Phillips were observed talking to each other in the lobby of the downtown Dallas office building by Antonio Vecchiana, a prominent Cuban exile leader of Alpha 66, and we've covered them as well. They basically were a terrorist organization. Vecchian, who arrived at the Dallas building for his own meeting with Phillips and who was his CIA supervisor, would later recognize Oswald when his face was splashed across the front pages and TV screens. Phillips had trained him well, Vecchiana said. He taught me how to remember faces, how to remember characteristics. He was sure it was Oswald. He told his story to the Assassination Committee investigator Gayton Fonzie in the late 1970s and later repeated it to journalists. But even when the aging exile leader climbed on stage at a Washington conference of JFK assassination researchers to retell his story, the mainstream press still did nothing to highlight it. I was trained by the CIA, as was Oswald, he said. He later was an accounting manager for a Havana bank before he joined, before he had been a Havana bank manager before he joined the anti-Castro movement. Oswald and Fidel Castro were ideal scapegoats for the murder of a president, a coup. That's his quote. In late September, Oswald took a bus trip to Mexico City and again made a spectacle out of himself while trying in vain to obtain travel visas for Cuba. While Oswald visited Mexico City, someone impersonating him made phone calls to the Cuban and Soviet embassies, calls that were intercepted by the CIA surveillance. The agency later claimed that these tapes were routinely destroyed. But J. Edgar Hoover himself listened to them immediately after the assassination, and the FBI chief informed LBJ that the voice on the tapes was not Oswald. Both men knew the stunning significance of fake audio tapes by the CIA. It showed that Kennedy's alleged killer was somehow entangled with the CIA and not a deranged loner. In the final weeks of his life, Oswald was the subject of intense CIA coverage. Much of the scrutiny emanated from the offices of Jim Angleton and David Phillips. After sifting through declassified government documents from this period, John Newman, a University of Maryland history professor and former U.S. military intelligence officer, concluded that the agency had demonstrated a keen operational interest in Oswald. Newman's skilled decryption of the intelligence design behind Oswald's activities, which he first outlined in a book called Oswald and the CIA, was a historical breakthrough in understanding Oswald's life. Oswald was ostensibly being closely tracked by the CIA as well as the FBI because he was a quote unquote defector and a self proclaimed revolutionary. But as JFK prepared to visit Dallas, something curious occurred with all this surveillance. On October 9th, Oswald was suddenly removed from the FBI's flash list, the Bureau's index of suspicious individuals to keep a close look on. FBI officials took this surprising step despite Oswald's suspicious behavior in Mexico. The day after the FBI took Oswald off its watch list, the CIA also downgraded him as a security risk. On October 10th, 4 senior counterintelligence officials who reported to Angleton and Helms signed off on a curious cable to the CIA station chief in Mexico City, assuring him there was no reason to be concerned about Oswald because his stay in the Soviet Union had a quote-unquote maturing effect on him. These signals about Oswald circulating in the intelligence community had a fateful effect. By downplaying the security risk, Oswald became an unchecked pawn, free to move about wherever. Appearing before the Warren Commission, Ruth and Michael Payne seemed confused and tentative when it came to assigning guilt to Oswald. They both agreed that while he was a man of headstrong conviction, he did not impress them as dangerous. And like George de Morgenschild, they said Oswald liked Kennedy. "I'd never thought of him as a violent man," Ruth said. "He had never said anything against President Kennedy. There was nothing that I had seen about him that indicated a man with that kind of a grudge." Michael seemed particularly at sea when he tried to make sense of Oswald. When Dulles asked him if he was convinced that Oswald was the assassin, Michael launched into a rambling, only somewhat coherent reply, winding up with a less than decisive conclusion. "I never did discover, and it didn't quite make sense for the most part. I accept it, the common view that he did it." In truth, Michael never knew Oswald very well. They only talked at length on 4 occasions. They would run into each other on some weekends when he was visiting his kids. One evening, Michael took Oswald to a meeting of the ACLU, which the Paynes belonged to. Afterward, Lee told Michael that he could never join a civil liberties group like that because it was insufficiently militant. Neither of the Paynes were fond of Oswald. To Ruth, he was self-involved and ill-tempered. He was just part of the equation that she had to put up with in order to have Marina in her life. I would have been happy had he never come out. Michael and Lee seemed to have more in common. 2 men who had grown up for the most part without fathers and were now struggling to hold their families together. There was something lost about both young men. They never hit it off. Lee was too dogmatic for Michael. He reminded him of his distant father, too wrapped up in political theories. Apart from providing a few suspicious circumstantial details, this was the Paynes' main contribution to establishing Oswald's guilt. Guided primarily by the Warren Commission lawyers like Albert Jenner and Wesley Leibler, as well as Dulles, the couple painted a portrait of Oswald as a grim subversive. But the Paynes also confirmed Oswald's guilt by just being themselves. Here were two oddballs. Their appearance before the panel seemed to signify a man and a woman with family pedigrees. They were just the type whom you would expect to unwittingly harbor a dangerous man like Oswald. Not at all. The Paynes reunited for a time after the assassination, but later divorced. In old age, they now live in the same Quaker retirement compound north of San Francisco. Michael sat down for an interview at a nearby commune where his middle-aged son, Christopher, and two dozen other people lived. It was a hippie ranch. While serving with the Army in the Korean War, Michael mentioned at one point during the afternoon, I thought of going over to the other side and saying to the Chinese, we don't have to fight like this. He said he preferred democracy. The Paynes seemed to grow more convinced of Oswald's guilt over time, but nowadays Michael is not as sure as Ruth. As he talked about the catastrophic days, he seemed bewildered, like somebody trying to explain a collision that he had survived long ago. He still wavered back and forth, just as he did with the Warren Commission. Oswald wanted to overthrow something, the enemy, capitalists, the oppressors. He wanted action, but he was definitely for Kennedy because he thought that's what Kennedy was doing. He liked Kennedy. He even quoted Oswald as saying, he was my favorite president. As November 22nd, 1963 dawned, the day of JFK's assassination, Allen Dulles was away from Washington, as he typically was anytime a major operation went down. In September and October, Dulles had maintained a busy schedule, still thick in the clandestine affairs, meeting with key officials from the CIA's covert side, like Desmond Fitzgerald, who, along with David Phillips, oversaw the violent intrigue swirling around Cuba. Angleton and his deputy, Cord Meyer, and a top Helms aide, Thomas Karamenson, all of these men would later be connected by investigators in one way to the CIA to the Kennedy assassination, the CIA's assassination of Kennedy. But as Friday, November 22nd, grew near, Dulles spent much of his time away from his Georgetown home base. His book tour, The Craft of Intelligence, provided the spy master the perfect excuse to travel. In the days leading up to the assassination, he made bookstore and media appearances in Boston and New York. Early on the morning of November 22nd, Dulles caught a Piedmont Airlines flight back to D.C., landing at National around 8:30 in the morning. He had then driven to a hotel, not his house, a hotel in Williamsburg, Virginia, where he addressed a Brookings Institute breakfast meeting. After receiving the news from Dallas around 1:30 in the afternoon, Dulles took a car back to Washington with John Warner, who was a CIA attorney. According to Dulles's date book, he did not spend the evening in his home in D.C. He headed back to Northern Virginia's countryside, where he would spend the entire weekend in a secured CIA facility known previously as Camp Perry, the farm. At the time of Kennedy's assassination, Dulles had no formal role in government, but here he was hanging out at one of the most highly secured CIA facilities in the world called the farm. The farm was not a club for CIA retirees. It was a clandestine center that Dulles himself had inaugurated soon after taking over the CIA. Before the CIA took over Camp Perry, a sprawling compound in the wooded area of Williamsburg, it was used by Navy Seabees as a base and then as a stockade for captured German sailors. Dulles turned it into a spy training base for recruits who were headed overseas. According to former CIA agent Philip Agee and Victor Marchetti, among the well trained professionals turned out at the farm, one of their required skills was that of an assassin. The facility was also what would later be called a black site, a secured location where enemy captives and suspicious defectors were interrogated at the farm. As CIA director, Dulles had built himself a comfortable home on the farm for him to stay overnight. Allen Dulles had a home on the farm. Years later, consultants like Chalmer Johnson, an Asian affairs expert who became a scorching critic of the U.S. empire, would be housed there during agency conferences. Johnson recalled the retired spy master's well-stocked library containing all the latest CIA reports, intelligence estimates, and classified journals. The farm was basically an alternative CIA headquarters from where Dulles could direct operations without being seen. This is the CIA's command post, where the retired Dulles situated himself from Friday, November 22nd to Sunday, November 24th, a highly eventful weekend during which Oswald was arrested, questioned by Dallas police. Kennedy's body was flown back to Washington and subjected to an autopsy riddled with irregularities, and Oswald was gunned down in the basement of the Dallas police by a mafia-associated nightclub owner. A year after the assassination, Dulles was interviewed by an old CIA colleague, Tom Braden, for an oral history project for the JFK Library in Boston. Braden asked Dulles what he had thought of Kennedy as a man. Dulles put on his mourning mask and said, "Oh, I rate him high. I shall never forget when I first heard the news of the Dallas tragedy. I felt that here is a man who hadn't had a chance to really show his full capabilities, that he was just reaching a point where his grasp of all the intricacies of presidencies were such that he could now move forward, so we killed him." He didn't put that part in there, but he's accurate. Kennedy was just realizing how evil the CIA was. Then he was shot, arranged by the CIA. And that's what they do. They tell you this stuff in a way that it makes it sound like they're being sympathetic, but they're not. I've gotten a lot better at translating CIA speak. Dulles told Braden he had the opportunity to examine the assassination in exquisite detail. He talked about the events of the day as if he were inspecting the inner workings of a fine watch. He seemed in awe at the intricate meshing of the parts, that they occurred in order for Kennedy to die that day. His description made it sound like he was reviewing an operational plan of a lifetime. If the employees of the book depository had eaten their lunch in a different place, Dulles said, if somebody had been at one place where he might easily have been instead of another at one particular time, the ifs just stand out overall. And if any one of those ifs had been changed, it might have been prevented. It was so tantalizing to go over the details of the events as we did, trying to find out every fact connected to the assassination. And then to say, if any one of those chess pieces that were entered into the game had been moved differently at any one time, the whole thing might have been different. But he carefully arranged the chessboard to make sure that did not happen. In his calendar for October 2nd, 1963, Dulles penciled in an interesting appointment, Dillon, That was C. Douglas Dillon, the Treasury Secretary and former Wall Street financier. After Dillon's name, Dulles wrote bank reps. There was no further explanation for the appointment, but the proximity of the meeting to Kennedy's assassination raised questions, particularly since Dillon, as Treasury Chief, was in charge of President Kennedy's Secret Service details. And the banking industry was locked in a long running battle with the president over his economic policies. I don't think the bank reps meant that. I think the bank reps was a code word for the Secret Service people. When it came time to undertake the secret missions, Allen Dulles was a bold and decisive actor, but he acted only after he felt that there was a consensus. He acted after he was told what to do by the people he actually worked for. One of the principal arenas where the consensus was created was the Council on Foreign Relations. The Dulles brothers and their Wall Street circle that dominated this private bastion of shaping public policy since the 1920s. Over the years, the CFR meetings, study groups, and publications provided forums for the organization's leading members, including Wall Street, bankers and lawyers, prominent politicians, media executives, academics, to hammer out major U.S. policy directions, including the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan and the Cold War strategy of quote unquote containment. The CIA engineered coup that overthrew Guatemala's democratic government was put in motion by Dulles after a CFR study group urged rough action against Arbenz administration. If CFR was the power elite brain, the CIA was its black gloved fist. As the global reach of the U.S. industry and finance grew during the post war era, so did the U.S. national security complex. America's vast system of military and covert power was aimed not at checking the Soviet threat, but protecting U.S. corporate interests abroad. We've come to that same conclusion. Behind the rapid international growth of multinational giants like Chase Manhattan, Coca-Cola, Standard Oil, and GM lay a global network of U.S. military bases, spy stations, and alliances with despot regimes. And if they didn't have one, they'd just install one. The twin pieces of the Cold War and the U.S. empire gave the national security establishment unprecedented free rein. The CIA was empowered not only to engage in deadly spy versus spy antics, but to subvert democratic governments they deemed insufficiently Americanized and to terminate these governments' elected leaders. Dedicated to dark necessity of expanding American power, this security complex began to take on a hidden life of its own, untethered from any checks and balances. Sometimes CIA officials kept the White House and Congress informed. Often they did not. When John Chancellor of NBC News asked Dulles if the CIA made its own policy, the spy master insisted that during his tenure, he regularly briefed congressional committees about the agency's budget and operations. But he added, Congress generally preferred to remain blissfully ignorant of distasteful things done in the government's name. When I appeared before them again and again, I had been stopped by members of Congress. We don't want to hear about that stuff. Don't tell us. This head in the sand attitude gave Dulles enormous leverage. But Dulles was not some out of control freebooter within a system of American power. Though his actions often revealed knife cold psyche of a murderer, in many ways, he was a sober minded corporate lawyer. When he took extreme action or executive action in the CIA's parlance for political murder, he did so with the confidence that it was implementing the will of his circle, not the will of the people, but the CFR. Doug Dillon was a kind of affluent Washington power player Allen Dulles listened to. Over the years, the Dulles brothers and Dillon grew quite close. It was Dillon's comfortable Florida retreat at Hobie Sound where the dying Foster spent his final days. And Allen was invited to enjoy himself at the chateau overlooking a vineyard at the Dillon's family owned mansion in southern France. The week he once spent at the Dillon's chateau in France was renewing my acquaintance with my favorite wines, he went on. When it came to taking executive action, Dulles might have been the chairman of the board, but he answered to a group of men far more wealthier and had far more power than he did, men like Doug Dillon. Dulles controlled the country's secret mechanism of violence, but the spy chief's power came from the fact that even after he departed the CIA, his wealthy sponsors continued to invest in him. In retirement, Dulles was still asked to take prestigious positions with the Princeton Board of Trustees, the CFR, and defense advisory boards. Dulles was invited to play leadership roles in these organizations because the men who funded them knew about his aggressive views in maintaining America's wealth and prestige in the world. The men who sat on Dulles's board of directors, as it were, the men with whom he discussed major decisions and exchanged correspondence and shared sunny getaways, occupied the very center of American power. Threats to these men's wealth and stature brought lethal impulses. This is when they turned to Dulles, the enforcer. Nobody occupied a more central position in the Dulles brothers' power circle than the Rockefeller brothers, Nelson and David. They were the most public of the 5 grandsons of John D. Rockefeller, the founder of Standard Oil, an unprecedented empire of wealth that would grow to include global banks, mining companies, ranches, and even supermarkets. The glad-handing, irrepressible Nelson would become the cheery face of centric Republican policies in the mid-century America, working as an advisor to Eisenhower on Cold War strategy and later becoming a popular governor of New York and perennial factor in the Republican presidential equations. His less outgoing and more analytical younger brother, David, would rise to become the CEO of the family bank, Chase Manhattan, as well as a leading spokesperson for international finance. Less well known, both brothers were militant advocates of U.S. imperial interest, particularly in Latin America, where the Rockefeller family had extensive holdings, and they had background in U.S. intelligence. During World War II, Nelson did not follow other brothers of East Coast high society into the OSS. Instead, the elder Rockefeller brother, who had a strained relationship with Wild Bill Donovan, ran his own private intelligence network in Latin America as FDR's south of the border point man. Nelson resumed his espionage duties under President Eisenhower, who put him in charge of a special advisory group that oversaw the CIA. In the press, Rockefeller was described as Ike's Cold War general. David Rockefeller served with a special Army intelligence unit in Algiers in World War II, where he was assigned to spy not on the Nazis, but on the country's anti-colonial movement, which was the subject of the French primarily because that was their colony. After being transferred to Paris, he was asked to snoop on the Communist Party elements that had played a role in the French resistance and were emerging as a strong political force in France. Rockefeller also set up a spy ring inside the provisional government of Charles de Gaulle, and soon came to dislike Charles de Gaulle, which is why their Gladio operators, which was initially funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, tried to kill him over 30 times. The Dulleses identified the Rockefeller brothers, who were generation younger as up and coming players, and they sought to bring them into the circle. They were already in the circle. You ain't kidding anybody. Over the years, the two sets of brothers became close partners in the Game of Thrones, helping advance one another's ambitions. The Dulleses ushered David Rockefeller into the CFR, where he soon became a major force, and Foster would become chairman of the family controlled Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefellers contributed campaign funds to Dulles favored Republican candidates, including Foster when he ran unsuccessfully for the Senate in New York. In January of 53, while Allen nervously waited to see whether or not he was going to be Eisenhower's CIA director, David took him to lunch in Manhattan and assured him that if things didn't work out in Washington, he could return to New York and be in charge of the Ford Foundation, because they're all in the same business. Dulles had already used to secretly finance CIA activities, meaning the Rockefeller and the Ford Foundation. After Allen did win control of the spy agency, he again turned to the Rockefellers to help finance things like MK Ultra. The Rockefeller brothers served as private bankers for Dulles's intelligence empire. David, who oversaw the donations committee for Chase Manhattan Bank Foundation, was particularly an important off-the-books flow of cash for the CIA, which basically means they were using it to money launder the drug money. Tom Braden, one of Dulles's top propaganda men, later recalled David's largesse. I often briefed David semi-officially and with Allen's permission. David was one of the same minds as us and very approving of everything we did. He did the same. He had the same sense as I did that the way to win the Cold War was our way. This is asked backwards. Rockefellers are the ones that were dictating it. He was just giving them a status update. David would give us money to do things which weren't in our budget. He gave me a lot of money for causes in France. Yeah, like trying to assassinate the French president. I remember he gave me $50,000 for someone who was active in promoting anti-communist United Europe campaign amongst European youth groups. This is Operation Gladio, by the way. The Rockefellers funded the initial money going into it until they got control of the drug empire. When the ambitious Nelson overreached as Eisenhower's Cold War advisor and began to infringe on the Dulles brothers' territory, Foster became exasperated with him and succeeded in having him jettisoned from the administration. But Allen managed to stay on good terms with Nelson and with David too. As he left the Eisenhower White House in December 1955, Nelson sent the CIA chief a gushing letter. I can't begin to tell you how much my association with you over this past year has meant to me, Nelson said to Allen. I have admired tremendously your strength and courage, your understanding, and your penetrating insight into the many problems that confront us. And by us, they mean them. You give yourself quietly and unselfishly, but your qualities of human understanding have shown forth to give courage to us all. Only a few will ever know how great your contributions have been to the security of our country. Not our country, them. Even Dulles, who had robust self-regard, seemed stunned by the praise. Dear Nelson, to say that I appreciate your kind remarks is an understatement. Overwhelmed would be a little more accurate. Dulles and Rockefellers continued their mutual courtship over the years, with both sides keenly recognizing the value of the relationship. After the 1958 election in New York, Nelson invited Allen to speak at a 1959 conference of state governors, which was held in Puerto Rico that year. While there, Dulles stayed at an exclusive Dorado Beach Club that was a luxury resort created by Nelson's brother, Lawrence. on prime coastal real estate owned by the Rockefeller family. When he got home, the CIA director told Lawrence, asking him to pull strings so that a friend and his wife could become club members, as they are both devotees of golf and swimming. Meanwhile, Dulles supplied the Rockefellers with CIA information about global hot zones in Iran, Cuba, and Venezuela, where the families had oil interest. JFK, as a young congressman and senator, often used the language of the Cold War in American politics. He was never fully accepted within the inner sanctum of power. Members of the American elite were uneasy that JFK's presidential bid from the beginning. Their skepticism started with Joe Kennedy, the candidate's father, who was remembered as an ardent New Dealer. Despite his relationship with FDR and as a banking maverick, some would call him a traitor, who had agreed to serve as Roosevelt's Wall Street watchdog. Nor did the young senator's provocative criticism of Western imperialism inspire confidence in corporate circles, where aggressive overseas expansion was the primary goal. John McCloy, the diplomat and banker known as the chairman of the establishment, could not bring himself to support JFK in 1960, despite the two men shared Irish history. Kennedy's standoffish attitude towards the Council of Foreign Relations put McCloy off, who was the organization's chairman. McCloy found Nixon hard to warm up to. He dismissed Kennedy as a lightweight. If the establishment harbored suspicions about the Kennedy family, the feeling was mutual. Despite his privileged upbringing, JFK had imbibed his father's bitter feelings as an Irish Catholic outsider. After he narrowly won the presidency, Kennedy told his aide, Theodore Sorensen, that he suspected the Wall Street bankers had tried to sabotage his election by spreading word that his election would set off a financial panic. In public, JFK tried to diffuse the Wall Street hostility against him with wit. During a June 1962 press conference, Kennedy was asked about a news report that big business was using the current stock market slump as a means of forcing him to do their bidding. Their attitude is now they have you where they want you. After a timed pause, Kennedy replied, quote, I can't believe I'm where big business wants me, unquote. But as usual, there was an edge to JFK's humor. After the laughter died down, he drove home his message, making it clear that he would regard any corporate sabotage of the economy as beyond the pale of acceptable politics. The growing gulf between Kennedy and the corporate class was epitomized by the increasingly bad relationship between JFK and the Rockefeller brothers. Kennedy's domestic and foreign policies posed a direct threat to the Rockefeller dynasty on multiple fronts. And considering the central role of the U.S. finance and industry played in the network of Rockefeller interests, any such threat was viewed by the business community as a challenge to American capitalists. Kennedy's tax reform policy, which sought to place a heavier burden on the super rich, were a primary source of friction. When the president, who was concerned about the flight of capital in the global market, tried to crack down on overseas tax shelters, international bankers like David Rockefeller screamed. Wall Street financiers saw that Kennedy's move as an assault on their ability to transfer wealth wherever they wanted to. Walter Wriston, a rising young leader in the First National City Bank and David Rockefeller's chief competitor in global finance arena, frankly expressed Wall Street's frustration with Kennedy. Quote, who is this upstart president interfering with the free flow of capital? Unquote. While many Wall Street executives complained bitterly about JFK in private, David Rockefeller took it upon himself to challenge him publicly. Henry Luce helped elevate Rockefeller as a Kennedy antagonist by giving the two men a debate forum in life. The magazine's introduction to the piece touted the young banker as an eloquent and logical articulator for sophisticated business community. In an open businessman letter to Kennedy that followed, Rockefeller took issue with the president's tax policies, which he insisted put too much burden on the investor class, and demanded a material reduction in the corporate income tax. The banker also took the president to task for his social spending, urging him to cut expenditures and create a balanced budget. The Rockefellers were perhaps even more alarmed by Kennedy's foreign policies, particularly in Latin America, which was not only home to their oil and real estate holdings, but a primary target for Chase Manhattan's overseas banking expansion. It seemed like an affront to the Rockefeller Southern domination when Kennedy announced a program called Alliance for Progress in March of 1961. It was a massive foreign aid program for Latin America designed to stimulate economic growth, redistribute wealth, and promote democratic governments in the region. They don't want democratic governments in that region. The alliance was spearheaded by Richard Goodwin, one of JFK's youngest and most ardent new frontiersmen. And the White House officials made no secret that the program was designed to not only counter Castro's revolutionary appeal in the area, but to sideline corporate interests that were exploiting the impoverished. Goodwin began pushing a variety of measures, which, by the standards of pro business Eisenhower era, was radical, including providing equipment for nationalized mines in Bolivia and offering U.S. government financing to state run oil companies. Even if Standard Oil and David Rockefeller objected, added Kennedy's Young Turk, soon enough the corporate pushback, along with the inevitable Republican Party and media fireworks, did come. Quote, neither U.S. nor Latin American businessmen took kindly to indications by Richard Goodwin, the president's chief Latin American advisor, that he thought private enterprise had a bad connotation in Latin America because it was associated with U.S. imperialism, unquote. And it was. Under increasing political pressure, JFK finally caved on Goodwin, transferring him from the Alliance for Progress to the Peace Corps. But Kennedy continued to resist efforts to privatize the alliance, led by David Rockefeller. America's reputation in Latin America was an imperial bully, and it mortified Kennedy. He was sick of the U.S. government being seen as a representative for private businesses. He was tired of Washington propping up tin-horn dictators and corrupt regimes in countries like Chile, where American copper companies controlled 80% of the foreign exchange. We wouldn't stand for that here, and that's no reason they should stand for it there. There's a revolution going on down there, and I want to be on the right side of it, Kennedy said. Kennedy's Latin American policies continued to be the point of contention between the Rockefeller brothers and him for the rest of the presidency. Even after JFK's death, his brother continued to fight the battle. During a 1965 tour of Latin America, Robert Kennedy, by then a senator in New York, found himself in a heated discussion about Rockefeller influence in Latin America during an evening at the home of a Peruvian artist. When Bobby brashly suggested to the gathering that Peru should assert nationhood and nationalize its oil industry, the group was stunned. Why, David Rockefeller has just been down here, and he told us there wouldn't be any aid if anyone acted against the International Petroleum Standard Oil subsidiary. Let that sink in. David Rockefeller was speaking on behalf of the United States government, saying he had the ability to turn off foreign aid. Bobby responded, oh, come on, David Rockefeller isn't the government. We Kennedys eat Rockefellers for breakfast. Unfortunately, they did not. The Kennedys were indeed more successful at the rough and tumble politics, but JFK had understood that was not the full story when it came to evaluating family power. He fully appreciated the Rockefellers held a unique place in American power, one rooted not so much in a democratic system as within what scholars would refer to as the deep state, that subterranean network of financial intelligence and military interest that pursued their ends regardless of who occupied the White House. The Kennedys had risen to the top of American politics, but they were still overshadowed by the imperial forces of the Rockefellers. So we're going to go ahead and stop right there.
Buried underneath 10 tons of nuclear rubble. Just saying.
Yeah. I mean, isn't that crazy, that story? I did not know about, I mean, I've read about Ruth Paine and her husband, Michael, and the fact that he worked at Bell Helicopter, which, for those of you who don't know, has a, like a skunk works, or at least it did, like Lockheed does. So, and he was an engineer. So he worked on developing new technology. So he had his own interesting, but their family background with CIA running all through it, that's just crazy shit. SR, go ahead.
Thank you, Colonel, and thank everybody for being here on Rumble and on Spaces. We appreciate your support. I'm sitting here thinking about, I'm sorry I drew a blank with Suite 8F, but the minute you mentioned it, it was like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
And then along came Camp Peary.
Yep.
And Camp Peary had a sister camp, which was Harvey Point.
Yep.
And
that's the demolition.
All
that's the demolition one.
Military training actually took place, if I understand correctly.
Are you talking about the one in North Carolina?
Correct.
Yeah,
yes,
that's the demolition one. That's where they learn how to blow shit up. They do all kinds of really weird things at Camp Peary, or at the one in North Carolina. I drove by it. We actually boated around the outside of it. It's right around the corner from the CIA's hangar where Blackwater had all of their air balloon vehicles. The CIA and Blackwater back in the day have these hangars on the back end of Elizabeth City Coast Guard station. So you go into the Coast Guard station, and if you go out into the water and go out towards the ocean, there's these really weird looking big hangars. They're like ribbed steel, oddly shaped, very tall, not like a normal hangar on a military base. And they were for their air balloons. They're like helium, slow overflight, spy things. That whole area is crawling with stuff like that. I had no idea, but my friend who has spent his whole life in military intelligence and worked for Blackwater for a while doing intelligence work for them, he's telling me all of these crazy stories of things that most people don't even knows around that area. It's crazy.
What I found I'm beginning to wonder if Dulles wasn't afraid he was going to get caught. And that's why he flew. That's why he stayed in Camp Peary.
Well, there was a lot of moving pieces in the aftermath. And my assessment is he was there as an operational commander. I don't think he had any fear that he was going to get caught. That the man did not know fear. Would it be a good place to go if he had fear? Yes, because they have the capability of airlifting him out of there. But I don't think that's what it was at all. In my opinion, he was still the operational commander, and he was on site to close up all the loose ends, which is why he knew so much of the details about him.
That makes sense, Colonel.
Yeah, because if you think about it, he's quote unquote retired. He wouldn't know all of the ins and outs of the details, especially in the aftermath, as they were, they happened fairly quickly and supposedly out of the blue. But he knew all of them. He knew everything that was happening, and to me, that's because he was in the command post making sure it happened. But I'm too far into this to look at any of this objectively. And what's fascinating to me is, I read The Devil's Chessboard about 6 months ago, and we had already kind of formulated all of the thought process of who's actually running this, which is how we came up with the name International Syndicate, and put all of the bankers and lawyers and people like that, and then the hierarchy above that, which are the shot callers. Um, and it's just really interesting reading these books and having these people masterfully put down in writing what we concluded based on our investigation, and just it's added confirmation that there's a lot of people out there that see it for what it really is. Yeah, SR-71 over there on Rumble, all roads lead to the Rockefeller. You've been watching too much of War Hamster.
Well, Colonel, when I stop and think about it, he initially funded it, okay? And since he initially funded it, what did he do right after that? He goes and opens up these foundations so that the money can flow freely, and they even admit that he's the one that's funding all of this under the table.
Yep.
So,
but that's kind of my conclusion, and that's what I was saying to Alpha Warrior the other day. I don't think any of these foundations are actually the family's wealth. I don't believe that at all. These foundations were set up to park covert black funds in, because you don't track they're private. There's no accounting for who's donating to them. And I think they were all used as money laundering opportunities so that they could operate in full view with these quote unquote foundations and fund all of these CIA fronts and make the entire network look legitimate. Their actual family wealth are in numbered bank accounts on the Isle of Jersey and shit like that, not in their foundations. And I also firmly believe that every single one of these people that are set up in these positions, like the Zuckerbergs and the Bill Gates and all that other stuff, that are basically handed military technology as to pretend that they created it, every single one of them was required to set up a foundation. And every single one of their foundations is funding the destruction of America. The same is true with Soros. He was given insider information about what government we were going to overthrow, and he'd just go out and short their currency and make billions of dollars doing it. But then he in turn has to spend that money on his assigned CIA projects. I don't believe any of them, not that they're not all nefarious assholes, but I believe this is 100% an integrated network that no one is paying attention to. They don't get it. But we do. We see it. And you would have to actually show me checks written to these foundations by actual people not associated with the CIA for me to ever believe that what I just said is not true. It is so crystal clear to me that they all fit the exact same pattern. And all they did with the foundations is just like they did with the R&D beside people's names. They just pick which side they're going to fund. It's all the same thing. and none of it benefits us. So, all right, that's all I got. So, we will be back tomorrow. I do have a show tonight. It's a new one. I will repost that on X, but let me pull up my calendar and I'll give you the name of it. It is Cole, Cole, Jack. I'll get his profile and just put a short post out as soon as we get done that announces that. And it's at 9 o'clock tonight. And then tomorrow we have War Hamster at noon. And I will be on a Russian podcast at 1:30, which I think is going to be a lot of fun. And we'll talk about it at 4 o'clock. And let's see, that's it. I will have another podcast with that crew on Saturday, and he records it, so I'll repost it as soon as he has it ready. So anyway, that's it. You guys have a nice evening, and hopefully I'll see you in the chat tonight at 9 o'clock. Take care. All right, guys, I'll go grab some dinner. Take care.